Okay, so hi everybody and welcome to our second Focus on VIPS webinar of 2026. This is hosted by the IAVCEI Commission on Volcanic and Igneous Plumbing Systems. My name's Janine Kavanagh. I'm the events coordinator on the committee, and my co-host today is Sonja Greiner, who is one of our Focus on VIPS bloggers. So we're very happy to welcome you today, and we have two fantastic speakers who are going to be talking to us about analog and numerical models of volcanic plumbing systems. So each speaker is going to have about 20 minutes, then we've got time for questions. Please use the chat function to type your questions, and then after each speaker, Sonja and I will read these out on your behalf. Just a quick announcement before we get started is that the VIPS Commission have a special issue out at the moment in the Bulletin of Volcanology, and the deadline has just been extended to the 30th of September. So we look forward to having your contributions. And I will pass over to Sonja.
Okay, thanks, Janine. So our first speaker is Ayleen Gaete Rojas, who did her PhD at GFZ in Potsdam in Germany, which was followed by a postdoc at INGV in Italy. And since then, she's worked at the Chilean Volcano Observatory. And since 2025, she is an assistant professor at Universidad Católica del Maule in Chile at the Department for Biology and Chemistry. She has a background in volcano monitoring, and her research focuses on magma propagation beneath caldera environments using analog and numerical models. So yeah, Ayleen, go ahead.
Thank you, Sonja, for the introduction. So I will share my screen. Can you see it?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. Hello, everyone. So I will present a work I carried out when I was doing my postdoc at INGV some years ago. It was, the title of this work was Investigating the Velocity of Magmatic Intrusions and its relationship with rocks' fracture toughness, insight from laboratory experiments and numerical models. So this work was in collaboration with Francesco Macaferri, Severin Forst, and Virginie Pinel. It was published in 2025 in Geophysical Journal International, as you can see here, if you are also interested to go deeper into the paper. And to start, when we started to work on this, our main question was how fast can a magmatic intrusion travel through the Earth crust? So here in this picture, for sure you can remember this, and it's the dike propagation during the Bunga crisis in 2014. So you can see that, well, if you remember, there was a dike propagation nucleating at the caldera and traveling about 40 kilometers away from the caldera to finally erupt at this area on the bend. So, and the full dike propagation was tracked through the hypocentral locations of the seismic activity, and could be observed that the full amount of time that took to travel was about 16 days. So basically, in some cases we can observe, and also in literature and other cases, is mentioned that this velocity, how the magma can travel, is not really something stable. Also can change in episodes and can vary from kilometers per day to kilometers per hour. So efforts to models the propagation of these dikes are made and by using key parameters such as magma buoyancy, fluid viscosity, and also the fracture toughness. Nevertheless, when the viscous force doesn't control the velocity, the key parameter is the fracture toughness. So basically, in those cases, the fracture toughness controls the propagation velocity. In this sense, so the question will be which values are realistic for this fracture toughness. So here we come to the first discrepancy in the models. So we have to cope in the models because when in papers published about laboratory samples, is possible and measuring the fracture toughness of these samples. They found that the values are about 1 megapascal square root meter, but estimations in the field of effective fracture toughness in magmatic dikes range from 100 to 4,000 megapascal square root meter. So basically, there is a big difference among these different also ranges of size, of length in dikes, and which was also plot by Scholz in 2010, like in this picture. So where he could, based on data, could demonstrate that the fracture toughness basically grows or gets bigger with the fracture length. So this tells us that the fracture toughness is not a static material property. Basically, this increased by 2 to 3 orders of magnitude from laboratory to field scale. So to find this kind of discrepancy, we understand that there is an energy required to nucleate a fracture, and it cannot be a simple constant value. So basically, it must be an effective parameter depending on the fracture velocity propagation. So this fracture energy must be treated as an effective velocity-dependent parameter. So furthermore, this is also a sketch from Su et al. 2022. So where you can see, well, they shows that when there is an hydraulic fracture propagating, there is a fracture process zones formed in the tip of this fracture. And this zone is hosted by, there are little fractures, microfractures propagating and developing in this area. And also, they say that considering that this is observed in little samples in the lab, at large scales, the fracture tip will develop a larger zone of microfractures and plastic deformation that dissipates much more energy than the small fracture created in the lab, as shown in this picture. So our hypothesis for this work was that the difference between lab and field scale of fracture toughness is likely due to non-elastic processes produced in this fracture or plastic zone, the fracture process zone, and at the fracture tip that dissipate energy at different rates. So to prove our hypothesis, we investigated the fluid field fractures processes across different velocity ranges and provide a scheme to estimate a velocity-dependent effective fracture toughness. So to come with this, we use a combined methodology of analog and numerical modeling. So the analog counterpart was carried out with gelatin experiments. So we prepared gelatin at 1.5% and 15, and also we add to the mix 15% of salt to increase the density and also to increase the density contrast between the gelatin and also the silicone oil that we injected to create cracks. So we left the gelatin box to cool down for 40 hours in the fridge to ensure that the cooling down process was homogeneous. And we estimated the density and the shear modulus. So the density was obtained by weighting the gelatin box. And we could observe that systematically the values were quite stable. So they didn't vary so much. These variations were from 1,101 to 1,000 to 129 kilograms cubic meters. And also we calculate the shear modulus through obtaining the shear wave propagation velocity by producing a perturbation on the surface of the gelatin model. So in the running process, we injected two kinds of fluids. The first one, as I mentioned before, we injected silicone oil, M10,000, which means that this oil is 10,000 times the water viscosity. The density of the silicone oil is 970 kilograms cubic meters, and the viscosity is 9.7 Pascal seconds. And for in the running process, we ran about 14 experiments and injecting 21, making 21 injections of 10, 30, and 50 ml of oil injections. And also we injected some transitions volumes for oil injections, and also we made air injections varying from 1 to 10 milliliters. And we repeated these experiments to ensure the accuracy of the results. So here you can see a picture of a sketch of how the experiment were looking. So we set two cameras, one in front and one above of the gelatin box, and we made pictures, if I'm not wrong, every 5 seconds. And from the pictures, we could obtain the experimental parameters such as the starting depth, the mean velocity, the minimum and maximum velocity using tracker, and also the dike geometrical parameters, like the opening, the length of the dike, and the width of the dike. And also we were able to calculate the stress intensity factor that depends on the fluid excess pressure. So here on the right side, you can see two images or two experiments. So in the left side is the pictures of one in oil injection with 10 milliliters. And above, also on the left side, is the velocity tracked through the propagation upwards. So you can see that there is an initial phase, more slower, and more faster, and then the velocity gets slower and propagate into the surface. And then, and the opposite, when we made the 10 milliliters air injections, we see completely the opposite behavior. So the crack start to propagate a little bit slowly, and then the velocity increase and propagates more or less with a stable velocity towards the surface. So we observed that the air-filled cracks travel up to the surface, and with a difference of about 3 to 4 orders of magnitude faster than the oil-filled crack. So the numerical part, for the numerical part, we use the 2D numerical models of Severin Forst, published in 2023. This is a boundary element method that integrates brittle elastic rocks fracturing with laminar viscous fluid to simulate or to calculate the velocity. And this method, or this numerical model, was used to overcome the limitation of the traditional static crack formulas that neglect the energy loss to the viscous flow of the oil. So this model works with the energy balance criterion, where the potential energy variation is calculated by the addition of the fracture energy needed at the tip and the viscous energy dissipation. So this model uses this energy balance criterion to calculate, to accurately compute propagation velocities for the viscous oil crack. So since these models, or the output of these models are in 2D, so we apply the geometric correction to bridge our 3D experiment results with these the numerical results through this equation. You can see in the lower part, where the the stress intensity factor in 3D is proportional to the stress intensity factor in 2D through this relation between the width and the length of the dike. So these are the first results, and where we can see that we calculated the stress intensity factor using the static formula for the oil injections and the air injections. And we can obtain our, if we extrapolate these results, we can obtain the fracture toughness. And for the oil injections, we observe that this fracture toughness is about 2.2 Pascal square root meters. But on the other side, for the air injection, the fracture toughness is 24 Pascal square root meters. So basically, these results differ more than 1 order of magnitude, and this provide that the values from different velocity range cannot be extrapolated to estimate the gelatinous strength. So we consider this relationship where the fracture toughness is equal to the stress effective fracture toughness when velocity turns to 0. This will imply that also the stress intensity factor is equal to effective fracture toughness depending on the velocity. So for those, we also calculated, we use the analog models values or inputs to now run simulations to obtain the best fit of the numerical models with the analog modeling. So we observe that the numerical models from the numerical models we can obtain the value of the gelatin fracture energy by trying to fit the velocities. And the velocities from the numerical model exhibit faster decay and larger final acceleration than experiments for the constant fracture energy that we obtain from here. So when we use these fracture energy values and we obtain the regression, we can come up with this relationship depending on the velocity. So this equation can provide us with a dynamic fracture energy relation that support the idea that the fracture energy is an effective parameter depending on fracture velocity. So then we use this dynamic value for the fracture energy, and then we run again the simulations, and we could obtain better results for our simulation, and that they fit much better to the analog models. So we could figure out that using this fracture energy, depending on the velocity, we could calculate also the effective fracture toughness to provide new estimates of fracture stress intensity factor for oil field cracks. So we did so, and I'm running out of the time, but I'm almost finishing. We could calculate again now the fracture, the effective fracture toughness from the numerical models and 2D, and then we convert them in 3D, and then we plot them together with the stress intensity factor that we calculated directly from our experiments. And we plot all together here for, and the bulk shapes are the oil field cracks here, and here you can see the air field cracks experiment. So what we could observe is that the regression that we can obtain for the effective fracture toughness is a square root relationship, and so that from the results we observe that only small volumes fit to the square root regression of the simulated effective fracture toughness, as you can see here in the lower part, while their injection fall out completely of the trend. So calculating, what this tells us is that the linear relation for the fracture energy, depending on the velocity, cannot be extrapolated over significant ranges of velocity, as you can see in this picture, where finally we had to come out with two different values for this fracture energy, depending on the velocity, one for the numerical models, considering the viscosity of the fluid, and also another one for the air field cracks, which doesn't, the viscosity is almost neglected. So in conclusion, after running our experiments, we applied, using the parameters from the experiments, we applied a 2D numerical model to isolate the combined effect of viscosity and fracture toughness on velocity. Traditional static crack formulas that neglect fluid viscosity are unstable for highly viscous fluid. This implies that a stress intensity factor differ by more than an order of magnitude between air and oil field cracks. So, and also accounting for the viscosity demonstrate that the faster a crack propagates, the larger the errors in a stress intensity factor estimates if fluid viscosity is ignored. And also that the fracture energy estimates cannot be grouped into a single linear regression across all velocity ranges. So the effective fracture toughness depends on the propagation velocity and likely other characteristics such as the crack dimensions and internal pressure gradients such as buoyancy. So, and the core message of our work is to predict a magmatic intrusion velocity. We have to consider an effective velocity-dependent fracture toughness in the theoretical framework. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Ayleen, for presenting. For the audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'll start reading them. And we already have our first question from John Browning, who asks, regarding fracture toughness experiments on Rock Lab, he agrees that part of the problem relates to the inelastic zones ahead of the fracture tip, as shown by Zhu and others. You mentioned that some of the lab-to-field scale, fracture toughness scale discrepancy is due to the size of fractures in the process zone. Do you think that this is because the absolute size of the fracture discontinuities in the process zone are too small in lab samples, or that the ratio between the hydraulic fracture length and the process zone fractures does not accurately portray nature in the lab experiments? Could that somehow be?
Yeah. Yeah, well, actually what, if I understood, because it's a little bit noisy here, but if I understood well, that, yeah, John is asking me if there is a relation or what else can be involved in this difference between laboratory and nature difference, right? And let me see if I can read again the question. Okay, I agree that part of the problem. Right?
So the part is, you mentioned that some of the lab-to-field KC scale discrepancy is due to the size of fractures in the process zone, and whether that depends on the like absolute size of the fractures or discontinuities in the lab, that they're too small.
We don't think that it is only related to the size. Must be some, well, of course, there is a big, a relation, because also you can see in the Scholz plot that there is a big discrepancy also in the values of fracture toughness along the size of the length. And for sure, there is something happening there in this area that probably, considering that in the lab the process is purely elastic when the samples are run. So in nature, there are some other energies like a release that are involved related to this area of the in the tip. That's considering that we are talking about dikes like with a width of meters sometimes. So this also produce that this big zone is produce much more cracks, and also is a much more big area, because also the tip of the dike must be also bigger. And this, before that the final crack is produced, this to create these small cracks, energy must be released, and this energy must be related to buoyancy factors, or also can be related to the length, in this sense of the size of the dike, the relationship between the size of the dike and also the size of the tip. I don't know if I hope that I could answer the question.
Yeah. I'll hand that over to John. But Janine has another question, or Janine has actually two questions. I'll maybe take just one in the interest of time. So her first question is whether there was a temperature contrast between the silicone oil and the gelatin. So if there were or might have been any viscosity changes in the oil during injection.
Yeah, well, actually, the silicon oil was room temperature, but the room temperature was no higher than 15 degrees, so we tried to keep everything at more or less at the same temperature. Of course, yeah, we also remember, I cannot remember right now everything, but I remember that also we measure after we ran the experiments, the temperature within the gelatin with the thermometer, and it was still like 5 degrees, 8 degrees. So yeah, there was a contrast for sure, but was not that big. I don't think that this has a big influence on our results. So the second question is, you describe shear models for the
Yeah, I think we're out of time for the second question.
No problem.
So in the interest of that, sorry. But thanks again for presenting, and I hand over to Janine for the second speaker.
Okay, great. So so next we have Meredith Townsend from Lehigh University in the United States. So Meredith did her PhD at Stanford University. She then followed this with a postdoc at Brown University and moved on to be assistant professor at the University of Oregon. She then moved to Lehigh University in 2023 to take on assistant professorship in Earth and Environmental Sciences. So welcome to Meredith, and you can share your slides now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Janine, for that introduction, and thank you so much for having me, and to the organizers as well. Let's see if this will work. All right, can you see my screen?
Yeah, I think that looks great.
Okay, so I'm excited to share some of the latest work on a project about the physical mechanisms by which glacial loading could influence magma plumbing systems. And this will be focused on a case study from the Southern Andes. I've been really grateful to do this work within a larger team funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation and led by Brad Singer from University of Wisconsin, and ultimately supported by contributions from everyone you see on this list. I'm going to especially acknowledge Dr. Pablo Moreno-Jaeger. Pablo is a postdoc at University of Wisconsin, and many of the findings I'll share today ultimately come from his incredible efforts in the field and in the lab. Pablo is also giving one of the next VIPS seminars, so if you want to learn more about the data that I'll preview here, I would encourage you to attend his presentation. Now, Pablo here is standing in front of an outcrop near one of our target volcanoes in southern Chile, where a thick rhyolite pumice is lying directly on top of a glacial till without much evidence of a time break. And I think this outcrop begs the question, did deglaciation trigger this eruption? Now, the hypothesis that glacial cycles influence volcanic activity has actually been around for decades, but these earlier studies were largely speculative. And then stronger evidence emerged from Iceland, where eruption rates increased 30 to 50 times during the most recent post-glacial period. More recently, global compilations of eruption records have shown similar post-glacial increases in activity. And really interestingly, TEFRA records from marine sediment cores collected globally and analyzed by Kutteroff and others actually contain Milankovitch frequencies, which suggests that global volcanism may actually be orbitally paced. Now, why would this happen? Well, in Iceland, the lithosphere is thin, and mantle flow models actually support that the loss of a 2-kilometer thick ice sheet could increase decompression melting rates about 30 times, which is consistent with what we see. But most subaerial volcanism actually comes from continental arc volcanoes, and these are going to be the main contributors to those TEFRA records recorded in the sediments that contain orbital frequencies. And in continental volcanoes, the lithosphere is much thicker, so the direct influence of glacial loading on mantle melting rates is probably more limited. We also think that at least over the timescales of glacial cycles, the rates and compositions of eruptions from continental volcanoes are more strongly influenced by crustal processes like magma storage and transport. So at the end of the day, we sort of need another set of explanations for why arc volcanoes would respond to glacial cycles. And so our team has been focused on a natural laboratory for this question in the Andean Southern Volcanic Zone. And this is a group of large subduction zone volcanoes that were covered by the Patagonian ice sheet at the last glacial maximum, or LGM. Locally, the LGM began around 35,000 years ago and lasted until about 18,000 years ago. And to reconstruct the evolution of the ice sheet, part of our team, led by Sean Marcotte, Marissa Tremblay, Josh Kazone, and others, combined geologic observations with numerical ice sheet models. They dated glacial deposits, including erratics, like you can see here, these granitoid rocks. They can actually be found at a consistent elevation on the volcanoes, kind of like a bathtub ring left by the ice sheet, which is really interesting. They're also working with Ben Edwards at Dickinson College to characterize glaciovolcanic features, such as these pillowed and densely fractured lavas. And altogether, their observations suggest that deglaciation began here around 18,000 years ago and then proceeded very rapidly, with most of the ice being gone within just a few thousand years, maybe 1,000 years or less. And these constraints were also integrated with numerical ice sheet models. So here I'm showing a cross-section of the model across two of our target volcanoes, Mocha-Chishwenko and Osorno. And you can see that the LGM ice got to be around 1 to 2 kilometers thick at its maximum extent. And there's a key observation here, actually, which is that the ice thickness was strongly controlled by volcanic topography. It was actually thicker in the valleys surrounding the volcanoes and comparatively thin near the summits. And this is something important to keep in mind when thinking about how ice loading could influence the subsurface plumbing system. So to understand how these volcanoes respond to glacial cycles, Pablo, with Brad Singer and others, are combining high-precision geochronology with erupted volume reconstructions, which you can see here plotted as cumulative volume erupted curves for several of the volcanoes. There's also an overlay of the Delta 18O curve for reference. And what they're finding is that eruption rates across the southern volcanic zone tend to decline during glacial period and then increase following deglaciation. But what's really cool, I think, is that in addition to changes in eruption rates, there are also, in many cases, changes in magma composition, eruption style, and even magma storage depth. So Pablo's work on Mocha-Chishwenko is one of the clearest examples of this. So I want to dive into that for just a minute. So prior to the LGM, eruption rates at Mocha-Chishwenko were around 0.4 cubic kilometers per 1,000 years, and they were dominantly fed by a basaltic andesite reservoir at about 7 to 13 kilometers depth, constrained from Pablo's geobarometry work. But then during the LGM, eruption rates fell to only about 0.1 cubic kilometer per 1,000 years, with an apparent pause in activity entirely, lasting for nearly 10,000 years. When minor amounts of magma eventually did break through during the LGM, these were also basaltic andesite, but they were enriched in incompatible elements and stored at roughly 11 to 15 kilometers depth, representing a deepening of magma storage by about 2 to 3 kilometers. Following deglaciation, the eruption rates actually increased to over 1.4 cubic kilometers per 1,000 years, and now included things like dacite and rhyolite from shallower levels, including even a large explosive caldera-forming rhyolite. And then by the Holocene, the system had basically reset back to baseline again, erupting its typical basaltic andesite from typical storage depths. So the new petrologic data give us additional clues about how the magma plumbing system responds, but to fully address the physical mechanisms, we've also been combining models for crustal stress change during loading with models for magma plumbing processes. So we recently built a suite of crustal stress models for our target volcanoes using outputs from the numerical ice sheet models. And the stress models consider both the load of topography and the ice sheet, but they simplify both as a distribution of point loads on an elastic half space. So I'm showing here an example from Mocha-Chishwenko, where the left panel shows the distribution of ice thickness about 25,000 years ago. And on the right is a cross-section of the stress perturbation from that load of the ice sheet. Now, because, again, ice was actually thicker in the valleys surrounding the volcano, the largest stress changes occurred directly beneath the valleys and not actually beneath the summits. So what you can also see is that loading from the valleys actually causes what we're calling a pinch point directly beneath the volcano, where if you're traveling directly beneath the center of the volcano down, initially stress increases, and then it reaches a maximum value before decaying again with depth. And what's really intriguing is that the location of this pinch point is at the same depth range where pre-eruptive magmas are being stored. So that's already telling us that maybe this plumbing system could actually be sensitive to ice loading. However, if you look at the values of the stress change from ice loading, the peak stress change at the pinch point is actually only about 5 or 6 megapascals, which is pretty small. At this depth, that would represent something like 3% of the lithostatic load. So, is that really enough to affect magma plumbing systems? Well, to test that, we've been focused on modeling the behavior of two main structures within the magma plumbing system. Magma chambers, or basically portions of the transcrustal magma column where relatively melt-rich, potentially eruptible magmas are being stored, and magmatic dikes that could be transporting magma through the plumbing system and potentially to the surface. So first, to address the magma chamber problem, in collaboration with Ali Kunin and Chris Huber at Brown University, we developed a thermomechanical model for magma chamber dynamics in the crust that considers stress change from ice loading. And the whole model lineage can be traced to this series of papers, but just to give a brief overview, the model is designed to track how a magma chamber in the crust would evolve thermally and mechanically in response to processes such as recharge and eruptions, interaction with a viscoelastic wall rock, as well as heat exchange with the crust and internal phase changes such as crystallization and volatile exsolution. And in Kuhn et al. 2024, the development of a time-dependent crustal stress is actually what allows us to then test how something like ice loading and unloading could impact the dynamics of a magma chamber system. So using this model, we identified and tested 3 different ways that ice unloading could influence magma chambers. And I'm just going to sort of give a brief overview of these, and you can read more details in the papers. We first of all found that unloading can trigger 1 or 2 eruptions in otherwise non-eruptive systems through a process of magma decompression and expansion against a stiff host crust. You can kind of imagine this would be like swimming down to the bottom of the ocean, tightening a belt around your waist, and then when you ascend to the surface, your body expands against the belt, building pressure. But as painful as that sounds, the actual amount of pressurization by expansion is very small, like less than 1 megapascal. And so this mechanism really only works in systems that are already very close to failure. We also found that decompression during ice unloading could trigger the exsolution of magmatic volatiles. And under the right circumstances, this exsolution can cause pressurization and eruption. But the change in volatile solubility from a 6 megapascal pressure change is actually very small. So this also only works for systems that are already basically perched at volatile saturation. So the third mechanism we tested was how changes in the confining pressure might influence reservoir strength, so that during periods of ice high stands, the rocks would be stronger and diking would be relatively discouraged, whereas during deglaciation, that reduction in confining pressure could weaken rocks, lowering the threshold for diking. But the change in rock strength from a 6 megapascal pressure change is again not actually that big. And so this also only works in systems that are basically just recharged enough and just barely pressurized enough before loading that they can be kind of shut off during the loading process. So yes, we technically identified 3 potential ways that ice unloading and loading could influence magma chamber failure. But first of all, none of these explanations also explain the other observations we have, like the deepening in magma storage during the LGM and the appearance of explosive silicic eruptions after deglaciation. But maybe more importantly, all 3 of these mechanisms rely on very narrowly constrained conditions. And so if we want to explain a global phenomenon like the tephra records in marine sediment cores, we need to find a mechanism that works under a broad range of conditions. So throughout this project, I kind of had a growing suspicion that maybe we were asking the wrong question and that maybe the answer actually didn't have to do with magma chambers, but had everything to do with dikes. This is a picture of shiprock from New Mexico. And if you look at this 10-kilometer long dike in the foreground, you'll notice that it curves. And it does so because ultimately dikes are just fractures, like we just heard about in Ayleen's talk. And fractures are extraordinarily sensitive to changes in the surrounding stress field. So even relatively small stress perturbations can redirect their paths. And if we go back to the stresses generated by ice loading, the absolute magnitude of the stress change is not very impressive, 5 or 6 megapascals. But what matters for dike propagation is not necessarily the magnitude of stress, but the stress gradient. And if we look near this pinch point, those gradients are actually moderately steep. In fact, the stress change over just a few kilometers is equivalent to changing the crustal density by about 70 kilograms per cubic meter. And so that realization led me to kind of a different set of hypotheses. Ice unloading may influence volcanism, not necessarily by changing magma chamber failure processes, but by modifying the pathways available to dikes. And I think it could do this in 2 different ways, either by influencing dikes that go between a magma chamber to the surface, or by influencing the recharging dikes that are coming up and feeding shallow magma chambers. So to test these hypotheses, I developed a model for planar 3-dimensional dike propagation based on mass balance between a dike and some depressurizing source feeding the dike. This model is based on the model of Siegel and others from 2001, but with the main addition of considering gradients in the external crustal stress field. In this model, the dike is idealized as a vertical ellipsoid, which facilitates the mass balance calculation. And then magma flow rate into the dike depends on the pressure difference between the source and the dike inlet. Once magma enters the dike, it flows to the tip regions, and the rate of tip growth depends on the pressure gradients available to drive flow to the tip region. And the opening or thickness of the dike then evolves following fracture mechanics for elliptical cracks. So ultimately, the model tracks dike growth in response to source pressure as well as crustal stress gradients, such as those from topography or ice loading. Okay, so here's an example of one dike growth simulation tuned for Mocho-Chishwenko volcano. The ellipses you're seeing are isochrons of the dike edges in what I'm calling face view. So the skinny part of the dike you would have to cut through and look at a cross-section of. So in this case, the dike is initiated at mid-crustal depths from a moderately large source volume with kind of moderate buoyancy. And you can see how the dike starts small, but then grows kind of radially and then rises up and actually veers off to the left. And this veering off to the left, in this case, occurs in response to the topographic load of the Andean Cordillera east of Mocho-Chishwenko. But if we take that same dike and apply the load from the ice sheet at the last glacial maximum, that same dike ends up becoming arrested nearly 10 kilometers down. Apparently, this dike can't break past that stress pinch point from the ice load. And now this is just one example, but the model is computationally simple enough to be run over many combinations of dike source depths and volumes. And so that's what we did. So here we actually have the results of thousands of simulations where the colored contours indicate the dike stalling depth in kilometers. And so cases that are predicted to reach the surface and erupt are shown as the blue triangles. And in general, something we see is that the deeper the injection depth, the deeper dikes tend to stall. But with increasing source volumes, dikes can actually ascend to higher levels in the crust. Now, if we compare the left and the right, basically the cases of ice-free conditions to full glacial high stand conditions, we see that many cases that would have erupted during ice-free times are now predicted to stall when ice is present. And in general, dikes under many combinations of source parameters stall deeper when ice loading is added. Maybe another way to see this is to difference these two plots and look specifically at the shift in dike stalling depth upon ice loading. And that's what the panel is in the lower right here. So the colors here show the downward shift in arrest depth. And I've capped the color scale at 2.5 kilometers because that's the deepening and storage we infer from Mocha-Chishwenko during the LGM. So anything in yellow is broadly consistent with the petrologic observations. Notably, we found that for dikes that initiate close to the pinch point or above it, those dikes actually remain largely unaffected. And I actually found that many cases suggest that ice loading actually helps the shallow dikes get to the surface more easily. And the easiest way to understand this is if you imagine squeezing a tube of toothpaste in the middle. The paste sitting, above where you squeeze gets squeezed out, but the paste sitting below the pinch point gets stuck or even moves down. And so what we think this means is that the effect on dikes is not necessarily to inhibit feeder dikes to erupt, but rather to cut off recharging dikes to shallow chambers. This also seems to be a really robust mechanism with a large shift in dike arrest depth over many combinations of parameters. So unlike the other mechanisms we had tested, this one does not require special conditions to work. But does it also explain the petrologic observations at Mocha-Chishwenko? It does, if we consider the effect of modulating recharge. So we can imagine that before loading begins, we have a basaltic andesite reservoir being recharged from a lower source and repeatedly triggered to erupt. But we can also imagine, once the ice sheet grows, these recharging dikes stall somewhere just below the active magma chamber, effectively abandoning it. And now the chamber doesn't have a source of pressure to erupt, so the system goes quiet. However, the repeated intrusion of magma to a new location, a few kilometers deeper, eventually builds up a magma chamber rich in incompatible elements that eventually gets large enough to feed a few eruptions at the surface. Meanwhile, the abandoned upper magma chamber is cooling down, crystallizing, and differentiating to more silicic compositions. Then, once the ice retreats, recharging dikes can once again ascend to the upper chamber, tapping long isolated, now silicic magmas, triggering potentially more explosive eruptions. So what I like about this explanation is it's robust enough to work at any heavily glaciated stratovolcano where topography ultimately influences ice thickness. And it also works to explain not just eruption rates, but also changes in eruption style and composition. If you're cutting down recharge for a while, allowing magmas to cool a bit before triggering them again. So it seems like a plausible explanation for Mocha-Chishwenko and several of the other volcanoes in the southern Andes, and it might even explain the orbital pacing of quaternary tephras globally. So with that, since I'm out of time, I'll just refer you to the paper that came out recently for more details if you're interested, and also to encourage you to come to the next VIPS seminar with Pablo. So thank you so much, and I'll take questions.
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Meredith. We have a couple of questions just popping in. So I'll start with one from Sonja. So she said, great talk, Meredith. Would you expect to see changes in the eruptive behavior for these or similar systems in the future due to current climate change, or is the amount of ice loss going to be too small?
Oh, that's a great question. So actually, we did kind of look at that in the Kunin et al. 2024 paper. That was a model originally developed for West Antarctica and the rift zone volcanoes there, and thinking about the current loss of ice over those volcanoes. So at the time, we were still focused on magma chambers, but we did find that actually with the sort of current rate of ice loss, we could expect some systems that are sensitive to potentially have a few extra eruptions because of the unloading, and they could even be more volatile rich, so potentially bigger eruptions. And that could even then have an interesting feedback with heat supply delivered to the base of the ice sheet, potentially triggering even faster ice loss. So that was something we explored in that paper. And so I think with the sort of new kind of dike model and the cutoff of recharge, I think that also introduces the possibility that, if that's something going on, at those volcanoes, then yeah, we might expect more explosive silicic, relatively silicic eruptions in the future. Yeah.
Okay. And then Ayleen has a question. So to estimate the load stress, did you consider an estimation of the volcano size at the time? And would this have been necessary? Just considering that the change in the load and the stress, even the change and the pinch point might be affected by those different topographies.
Yeah, that's a great question too. Yes, so we focused mostly on the last glacial maximum for those stress models. And so that was only 20 to 25,000 years ago. So the volcanoes didn't look too different from how they look today, with the caveat that some of them still had their tops on. So Pablo will probably share this in his presentation, but he's also found some evidence that following deglaciation, there are larger caldera-forming eruptions. So some of these volcanoes have lost parts of their edifices since deglaciation. There's also a lot of evidence for massive glacial erosion and mass wasting and processes like that. So minor amounts of edifice volume changes have occurred, but I think overall the volume was pretty similar. So I did take, for the Mocho example, I did take a reconstructed edifice using some of Pablo's and Ben Edwards' constraints on kind of reconstructing what the edifice would have looked like before the caldera forming eruption. So that was actually factored back into the topographic load.
Okay, great. So we have another question from Agnese Spina. So have you also tried considering regional stress in the simulations, as it could be a very important factor in the arrest or the ascent of the dike?
Oh yeah, that's a great question too. Throughout this whole project, I've kind of been thinking like ice loading is very interesting, but tectonic loading is sort of more obvious to look at, right? So I think this is something ongoing in our group, and I see Franziska Keller's on this call. Is this something Franzi's also thinking about? How does tectonic loading influence these processes? So we didn't consider any sort of tectonic loading in the model in this case. I do think in general tectonics might operate on a different time scale than the rapid deglaciation phase, at least in this particular area. But certainly tectonic loading should influence the crustal stress field in a big way, and this should definitely be a target of future research.
Great. I take Chair's privilege to ask you a question as well. So I was wondering about the pinch point for the deeper dikes. I was wondering, like, with the continued magma supply, I understand that the vertical ascent might be pinched or forced to stop, but would this just translate into lateral growth? And so we move out of the zone of influence from the loading, and so we end up having eruptions in different places than we might other expect?
Yeah, that's such a cool question. I think so. I did notice that some of the simulations do basically just show that, okay, they can't grow as fast vertically, so they do extend laterally to sort of compensate for that. And so then it's sort of a question of, do you have enough magma supply to grow laterally far enough that you can reascend and, once you're out of that zone of influence? So I think that kind of question would depend a lot on where the volcano is located with respect to the ice sheet. Some of the volcanoes are sort of near the margin of the ice sheet, and maybe the dikes could just barely escape. But a lot of them are pretty well surrounded by ice. So that would take a big volume of magma to get it out of there.
Okay, that's brilliant. Okay, well, thanks so much, Meredith. I'll pass you back to Sonja, who's going to say our thanks and goodbyes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I also just want to thank again both speakers for their really great and interesting presentations. And thanks to everybody in the audience for attending, for asking questions. The next seminar that was already teased a little bit will be on the 9th of September. And our speakers for that will be Madeleine Humphreys from Durham University in the UK and Pablo Moreno-Jaeger from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the US. And more detailed information for that and how to sign up will be sent out over the summer. So I would encourage everybody to keep a lookout for that. And yeah, thanks again for joining today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all so much again.